The air is thick and heavy, the kind that clings to your skin like it doesn't want to let go. Every breath feels louder than it should, as if the land itself is listening. Somewhere far off, cicadas scream into the evening, their endless chorus rising and falling like a warning no one quite understands yet. The ground beneath your feet is warm, red clay pressed flat by years of boots, hooves, and suffering. Imagine standing there, just at the edge of a southern plantation in the year 1877, watching the sun slowly sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and dying gold. It should be peaceful, but it isn't. There's something wrong in the air, something tense, something waiting, and then you hear it. A deep, furious snort cuts through the evening like a blade. Heavy hooves slam into the soil, tearing it open, sending dirt and dust flying. A wild bull, huge, muscular, unrestrained, has broken loose from its pen. Men shout, someone swears, someone else runs. But in the middle of all that chaos, there's a woman standing frozen in place, her parasol slipping from her hand, her breath trapped somewhere between her lungs and her throat. She never imagined she would need saving, and certainly not by the very boy she believed she owned. Now here's where the story bends in a direction history doesn't like to linger on. Because the boy who runs toward the danger doesn't hesitate. He doesn't scream. He doesn't stop to weigh his options or calculate the odds. He just moves. Bare feet pounding against red clay, heart hammering against his ribs, muscles burning with fear and purpose all at once. His name is Silas Bennett, and if we're being honest, history almost erased him entirely. Silas was born into a world that never asked his permission. He didn't arrive to celebration or choice or promise. He arrived quietly, on that same plantation soil, the Georgia red clay staining his tiny feet before he could even stand properly. His first cries mixed with the sounds of insects and distant labor, as if the land itself was welcoming him into its long memory of pain. His mother's name was Ruth. Ruth had hands that told stories even when her mouth didn't. Rough palms, cracked skin, fingers permanently curved from years of work. But when she held Silas, those hands softened. At night, after the overseer's footsteps faded and the plantation settled into uneasy sleep, Ruth would pull Silas close and whisper into his ear. Her voice barely louder than breath, barely louder than hope. "Remember who you are, baby," she would say, "even if the world don't." Silas was too young to fully understand what she meant, but he felt it. He felt it in the way she cradled his face like it was something sacred. He felt it in the way her body stiffened whenever a white man's voice rose nearby. He felt it in the way silence sometimes felt safer than words. By the time Silas was old enough to really remember anything, he was already working. At 7 years old, he carried water buckets nearly as big as his torso. He dragged tools that scraped against the ground because his arms weren't long enough to lift them properly. He learned to keep his eyes down and his ears open. He watched his mother's back bend lower every year, watched the strength slowly drain from her shoulders, and he learned a lesson no child should have to learn. That survival often means becoming invisible. The plantation mistress, Margaret Whitmore, hardly noticed him at first. To her, Silas was just another moving shadow among many, another black child with dirt on his knees and silence in his mouth, another presence meant to work, not to be known. But Silas noticed her. He noticed everything. That's what happens when your safety depends on reading people correctly. Margaret Whitmore wasn't cruel in the way stories often describe cruelty. She didn't shout for pleasure. She didn't carry a whip herself. Her cruelty was quieter, colder, more comfortable. She believed slavery, and what came after it was simply the natural order of things. God's will, family tradition. She wore soft dresses, spoke politely, and carried herself like a woman of refinement. But refinement has a way of standing very close to unimaginable harm without ever acknowledging it. Even as a boy, Silas felt the weight of that. Contradiction every time she passed by without looking at him. Now, this is where history likes to blur the edges. Slavery was officially over by 1877. On paper, the chains were gone, but freedom, you see, is a complicated word. On plantations like this one, very little actually changed. The names shifted, the rules adjusted, but Silas was still there, still working, still bound, this time by debt, by threat, by the simple truth that there was nowhere safe to go. And then one summer night, his mother didn't wake up. Fever took Ruth quietly, cruelly, while the crickets kept singing, as if nothing in the world had changed. Silas sat beside her, holding her hand as it grew colder, memorizing the feel of her skin because he somehow knew this was the last thing he would ever have of her. No ceremony, no grave with a name that would last, just silence and the sound of insects doing what they had always done. After that, something inside Silas shifted. People said he grew quiet, but the truth was, he grew inward. He listened more, watched more, learned more. He learned where the bulls were kept and which fences were patched together just well enough to look strong. He learned which men drank too much and which ones watched too closely. He learned the moods of animals and people alike. And most of all, he learned that danger rarely arrives without warning. It whispers first, then it roars, and that brings us back to that evening. The bull had been restless all day, anyone paying. Attention could see it, the way it scraped the ground, the way its muscles tensed beneath its hide, the way its eyes rolled white with agitation. But attention is a luxury people don't always take. Someone left a gate unlatched. Someone assumed nothing would go wrong, and just like that, chaos was loose. Margaret Whitmore had stepped outside for fresh air, her parasol tucked under her arm, her thoughts likely far from the field she owned. Perhaps she was thinking about supper, or letters, or nothing at all. When the bull charged, time seemed to slow. There was a terrible, frozen moment where she simply stood there, her mind unable to catch up with reality. Shock does that to people. It steals movement. It silences reason. Her scream came late, thin, almost fragile against the sound of hooves tearing into earth. Men scattered. Someone shouted for a rifle. Someone else yelled a warning that came too late to matter. But Silas was already running. Now pause here for just a second. This boy, this young man, really barely 16, had every reason to turn away. The woman in danger represented a system that had crushed his family, that had taken his mother, that had stolen his childhood piece by piece. No one would have blamed him for doing nothing, but something deeper than bitterness moved him. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the way Ruth had raised him, or maybe it was the quiet understanding that some choices, once made or not made, follow you forever. Silas grabbed a loose rope, the kind used to tie feed sacks. His heart thundered so loud it felt like it might tear him apart from the inside. He didn't plan to fight the bull. He knew better than that. He planned to distract it, to become the thing it noticed instead. He waved his arms. He shouted. He threw dirt into the air, anything to pull the animal's attention away from Margaret. And for one brief, impossible moment, it worked. The bull turned, its eyes locked onto Silas. The ground shook as it charged him instead. Margaret collapsed behind him, falling to her knees, breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. A shot rang out into the air. Another man drove a spear into the bull's flank. Dust and blood and noise filled the world all at once. And then, slowly, it was over. Silas didn't move. He just stood there shaking, rope still clenched in his hands, staring at the fallen animal like he couldn't quite believe the world had let him live. For a moment after the bull finally fell, there was no cheering, no relief loud enough to name itself. Just dust hanging in the air like smoke after a battle, drifting slowly back to the ground. The cicadas had gone quiet, as if even they were holding their breath. Silas stood frozen, his fingers still wrapped tight around the rope, knuckles white, arms trembling not from weakness, but from the sudden absence of fear. When danger leaves all at once, it leaves you hollow, empty, unsure what to do with the body you still inhabit. Margaret Whitmore remained on her knees behind him. Her dress was torn at the hem, stained with dirt and grass, something she had never allowed before. Her parasol lay snapped in several feet away, its lace crushed into the earth like it never mattered at all. Her breath came in short, broken gasps. She was alive. She knew it, and she knew why. Silas didn't turn around. Not yet. He could feel her there without looking. He could feel the weight of her eyes on his back, the same eyes that had passed over him 1,000 times without stopping. But now they lingered. Now they saw him. Someone finally grabbed Silas by the shoulder and pulled him back, checking for wounds, shouting questions he barely heard. Another man cursed under his breath, shaken by how close it all had come. The overseer stood stiff and pale, his authority shaken in a way no one would dare speak aloud. Margaret stood slowly, unsteady on her feet. For a brief second, she looked as if she might fall again. Some say she reached for Silas then. Others say she hesitated, her hand stopping short of touching him. What is certain is that she said his name. Not boy. Not you. His name. Silas. It came out quiet, almost unsure, as if saying it was itself a risk. He turned then, slowly, their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them that no ledger could ever record. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't equality, it was recognition. Simple, unsettling recognition. People argue about what she said next. Some claim she thanked him through tears. Others insist she couldn't find the words, that shame finally found her voice and silenced it. The truth, like most truths, likely lived somewhere between. Gratitude tangled with confusion, relief knotted together with fear, because if Silas was capable of such courage, what else had she been wrong about? That question lingered long after the dust settled. In the days that followed, the plantation buzzed with whispers. A black boy saving a white woman was not a story that sat comfortably with anyone. It challenged the order people depended on to make sense of their world. Some spoke of it like an accident, others like a miracle. A few spoke of it as a threat. The overseer pulled Silas aside one morning, his voice low and sharp. He warned him not to let the moment go to his head. Told him to remember his place. As if courage had a proper boundary. As if decency needed permission. Silas listened. He always listened. He nodded. He said nothing. But inside, something refused to shrink back to where it had been before. Margaret Whitmore began to change, not loudly, not all at once, but in ways that mattered on that land. She called Silas to the house, asked him to run errands inside instead of out in the fields, gave him tasks that kept him closer, safer. When she spoke to him, she spoke like he was a person who could hear nuance, not just commands. "How old are you?" she asked one afternoon, standing near a window flooded with warm light. 16, ma'am." Silas replied. She nodded, as if doing the math in her head, as if suddenly aware that he had been growing up right in front of her all along. Silas noticed the shift, but he didn't trust it. Kindness on plantations had a history of expiration. Gratitude faded. Circumstances changed. He had learned not to build hope too quickly. Hope, when taken away, hurt worse than fear. Still, the changes came. He worked less in the fields. His hands healed. His back straightened. At night, he found discarded newspapers and old letters left behind by visitors or shipments. He traced the letters with his finger, sounding them out quietly, like prayers he wasn't sure would be answered. Reading wasn't encouraged, but no one stopped him either. And sometimes, what no one stops becomes its own kind of permission. In those quiet moments, he heard his mother's voice again. "Remember who you are, baby." Years passed. Slowly, painfully, the plantation began to crack under the weight of a changing world. Debt crept in, labor shifted, laws changed in ways that confused and angered those who had benefited most from the old ways. Margaret Whitmore aged, her hair silvered, her certainty softened at the edges. Silas grew into himself, stronger, calmer, more deliberate. He carried the memory of that evening with him like a scar you can't see but always feel. He never spoke about it unless asked. And even then, he spoke carefully. He understood something most people didn't, that stories are powerful, and power attracts danger. When the plantation finally broke apart, there was no grand farewell, just wagons leaving, furniture sold, fields left untended. Margaret Whitmore's life was neatly folded into records and family Bibles, her name preserved in ink that would outlast her bones. Silas left quietly. He took nothing with him but his name, and the memory no one else seemed eager to claim. His story survived the way many stories like his do, in fragments, in oral histories, in whispered retellings passed down by people who understood what that moment meant, not as a fairy tale, not as redemption, but as proof. Because this story was never really about a bull, or even about a rescue. It was about choice, about a boy born into chains who, when faced with a moment that demanded an answer, chose action over bitterness, courage over hatred, humanity over revenge. That choice didn't free him overnight. It didn't undo the injustice he lived through. It didn't return his mother or give him back his childhood, but it freed something inside him, something no system, no law, no person could ever own.